Hola, ¿cómo están? ¿Me confirman, porfa, si se escucha y se ve bien en lo que llega el doctor Campbell? Bienvenidos a todos y todas. Ok, mil gracias, tocaya. Esperamos un segundito en lo que se conecta el doctor y comenzamos. Ahí está. Déjenme. Hi, Dr. Campbell.
Hello.
How are you doing? How's your day going so far?
Oh, it's going good. Just a lot of different meetings, but I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I can imagine that you're a really busy person. So anyway, thanks a lot for being here, for accepting my invitation. It's a huge honor, Dr. Campbell.
Yes, and I see Kim D. Fit has joined us. She's somebody that's been following me for a long time.
Everybody that has fit on their name is kind of expected to follow you, right? So very well, Dr. Campbell, the topic at hand that I wanted to discuss with you, well, more so than discuss, to learn from you, is about refeeds. What are refeeds? What is the purpose of a refeed? About your 2020 recent study, and then some comments. It was by Jackson Pius, if I recall correctly, and all that controversy and the practical takeaways from refeeds, when to apply them, all that. But first and foremost, establishing a little bit of common ground, starting with what is actually a refeed. Could you is it okay by you if we start with that, with the definition of a refeed, Dr. Campbell?
Sure, yes, that'd be great.
Very well.
So I think let's define what a refeed is first. The broad category is called nonlinear dieting. And basically, nonlinear dieting is the opposite of when somebody goes on a diet and they stay on a diet or a caloric deficit for weeks and weeks, months and months consecutively. So that is the opposite of nonlinear dieting. A nonlinear diet would suggest that we do not have a caloric deficit indefinitely for 12 weeks, 20 weeks, 6 months in a row. Rather, we're going to introduce some periods where we stop the diet or take a break from the diet, where we will refeed the body. And we do that because we know that dieting has negative consequences. So that leads me back to the only way that a diet refeed or diet break will work is if we have an appreciation for the negative consequences that dieting has. So let's start with that. What are these negative consequences?
Right.
So there are multiple. Let's assume that people are trying to maintain their muscle mass when dieting. So if we're concerned with about fit people, exercise enthusiasts, many of them want to lose fat, but they don't want to lose muscle. So what we know about dieting is a caloric deficit has impacts that are not favorable to maintaining muscle mass. One of them, there's a research study that was done by Pasiakos, and I think this was in 2013 or 2012. They put subjects on a 20% caloric deficit for a 10-day period. And they measured muscle protein synthesis before and after the 10-day diet period. And what they found was that there was a 20% decrease, actually 19% decrease in muscle protein synthesis during this diet period. So there's one negative. The other side of muscle building is muscle protein breakdown. We want to keep muscle protein breakdown as low as we can. We don't want it to be high, because if it's high, that means we're obviously losing muscle mass. So another study, this was done by Carbone, and I think this was published in 2014. They did a very similar study. They gave subjects a 10-day caloric deficit of 20%. And what they found was that muscle protein breakdown increased by nearly 60% just from a 20% caloric reduction. So both of those factors, a lowering of muscle protein synthesis and increase of muscle protein breakdown, are working against our goals and our efforts to maintain muscle mass. Just briefly, some of the other negative consequences of dieting related to muscle mass: we have a blunted anabolic drive. So we have research that has reported that growth hormone gets converted to IGF-1, and during a caloric restriction, particularly if it's a severe caloric restriction, there's a blunting of growth hormone to IGF-1. We also know that we have a decreased metabolic rate with dieting. As we lose weight and decrease our calories, we have what's referred to as metabolic adaptation. That's a slowing of the metabolic rate, more so than what would be predicted just from weight loss. So there's yet another negative consequence. And then, of course, we know that there are hormonal influences. So leptin levels go down. That makes us have a higher hunger drive. We have more hunger, obviously, more irritability. So if we can appreciate all of these negatives, that's when we can start to ask, well, what can we do to help prevent these negative consequences of dieting? And that's where diet refeeds or diet breaks have a place in somebody's strategy. So there's my background. Hopefully that was helpful.
Really helpful to establish a common ground for the purpose. Actually, you, with all that information, you already answered my second question, which was, what's the purpose of a refeed? And I recall I was talking with Eric Drexler recently, well, more so last year, about all the metabolic adaptation, hormonal adaptation, and how can a refeed, let's say, get out of the deficit, be of help. But we really didn't have any direct research until then, until 2020 with your study, which I think it's the only one that actually use resistance trait individuals. Could you tell us a little bit of the study and what was the point of the study? How did you measure? What did you do? How was the protocol for the refeed? Could you tell us a little bit of the study, Dr. Campbell?
Sure. Yeah. And I to the best of my knowledge, it was the only study in resistance trained people.
Right.
So we had two groups of resistance trained people, and these were males and females in this study. The first group, we said, you're going to go on a diet and you're going to reduce your calories by 25% every day for a 7-week period. You're never going to go off of the diet for 7 weeks. The other group, we said, you are also going to diet for 7 weeks, but you're going to take a diet refeed. And by refeed, we meant 2 consecutive days of higher calories in the form of carbohydrates that took them back to maintenance levels. And we determined maintenance levels in the 2 weeks prior to the study started. So they got a break from the diet every 5 days. But what that meant was during the week, Monday through Friday, they had to reduce their calories by 35% because we wanted to match the total caloric deficit. So at the end of the week, both groups averaged a 25% caloric restriction or caloric deficit over every week for 7 weeks. We measured body composition. We use ultrasound for our body composition measures. We also measured resting metabolic rate, and we measured leptin levels only in a subset of subjects. I think only like 9 out of the 27, or about a third of them, did we get leptin measurements on. So the outcome of our study was at the end of the 7 weeks, the control group, the group who never took a break, they had a significant loss relative to baseline of their fat-free mass. Let's just call it their muscle mass.
Right.
They also had a decrease in their dry fat-free mass, which I'll talk about that in a moment. And that's just another way to measure muscle mass. And then the third area, relative to baseline, they had a significant reduction in their resting metabolic rate. So all 3 things, or let's say 2 of the most important things, metabolic rate and muscle mass, both decreased in that group, which isn't surprising because they're dieting for 7 weeks. We did have them resistance train 4 days per week in my lab, and we had them eat, I think it was 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. The other group, the refeed group, the group who got carbohydrate refeeds 2 days in a row each week, basically on the weekends, they also had a loss of muscle mass, but it wasn't significant. They also had a slowing down of their metabolic rate, but it wasn't significant. When you compared the two groups, we found that there was a significant difference in the dry fat-free mass measure. So that's an important measure that we have done in my lab. We've done that, I think, in 2 separate studies. Dr. Mike Roberts from Auburn University, he has also used that approach in some of his studies. The reason that we used a dry fat-free mass measure was because we were manipulating carbohydrates. And if you're going to increase carbohydrates in somebody, that will increase glycogen levels. And glycogen levels, for every gram of glycogen you have, it usually pulls in about 2.7 to 3 grams of water for each gram of glycogen. So you got to be careful when you're looking at glycogen changes, because if you're bringing in this water, it may make it look like you're gaining muscle mass when you're really not, when it's just water weight because of glycogen. So we subtracted out all of the water from our subjects, and we reported what's known as a dry fat-free mass measure. So the gains couldn't be due to water. The other thing that we did to try to help prevent any influence of the carbs, we had everybody wait for 2 days after their last refeed before they got tested in the lab. So again, hopefully that there was some time where glycogen levels wouldn't be as high. So that was what we found. So this was the first study in resistance trained people where there seemed to be a little bit of a benefit. And again, we can also talk about the effect sizes, the confidence intervals. All of the data was pointing in a direction where it was favorable, and then in the case of dry fat-free mass, significantly superior than a straight diet where there was no diet refeed.
Right, I think that's a really important point because in common practice, let's say with daily clients, with check-ins and all that, we don't really use ultrasound. Maybe we use bioelectrical impedance. And let's say we implement refeeds, and okay, you're gonna do a refeed, and I don't wait 2 days. Maybe I do it the same day. I do the weighting in the bioelectrical impedance, and all of a sudden you gain muscle, you lost more fat than previously, but that's not actually tissue. It's precisely water, glycogen. So I think it's really important that you talk about those details. How did you measure? And even then, do you think there can be some sort of room for error in regards to glycogen and water retention because of the glycogen of the refeeds? Because we know it's from carbohydrates.
Yeah, there's going to be error in everything that we do. The advantage that we had was the fact that we did measure body water, so we could account for that. I would say the worst thing you could do in these kind of studies is use bioelectrical impedance as your primary body fat or lean body mass measure. Now, we always use that, but we use it mainly for its stated purpose, which is to measure body water. The other thing, the people doing our body composition measurements, they're highly trained. We calculate their test to retest reliability, their measurement of error. So we do everything we can to make sure that the error rate of measurement is as small as possible.
Right, because the comment that was published by, I have it right here, by Pios and Brown and all of them, it says, well, the title, contrary to the conclusion stated in the paper, only dry fat-free mass was different between groups. Could you address a little bit of that recent response to your study, Dr. Campbell?
Yeah, so a different group saw our interpretation of our data, and they had basically, I think, 2 main concerns with how we did our study and also how we interpreted the results of our study. The first thing was they suggested that we also report the data on subjects who didn't finish the study. So that's called a intention to treat analysis. And in my research, and generally the whole exercise science literature and sports nutrition literature, that's not done. We don't necessarily care about the subjects who didn't follow the diet or who didn't do the workouts. So if they didn't complete the program or they didn't follow the diet, we didn't analyze their data. Now, in
Right.
clinical nutrition research, that is typically done where regardless if the person followed the diet or program, they will analyze that data separately and also present that. So that was one thing. And again, my response to that was in clinical nutrition research, that could be beneficial. In my research, which is the market is fitness enthusiasts, I think we can all agree that if you don't follow the diet, you won't lose weight. So again, we didn't really put an emphasis on what happens if you didn't follow the diet. I think you should just assume you won't lose fat or you won't gain muscle if you don't lift weights. The other thing was they were making comments about our interpretation of the data. And I think they made a very good point. In certain aspects of my discussion, there was language to suggest that there were significant differences in metabolic rate and fat-free mass between the groups. But the only difference between the groups was dry fat-free mass. The other differences were compared to baseline. So what we found was the group had a significant loss of muscle mass or fat-free mass relative to baseline for the group that didn't do the refeeds. They also had a significant decrease in resting metabolic rate when compared to baseline. The other group, the refeed group, did not experience significant decreases in metabolic rate or in muscle mass relative to baseline. But that's a little different than saying there are significant differences between the groups. So they were commenting on the language that we used in our interpretation of the data.
Right.
And I think they made a good point. And in my response to them, I thank them for their comments and also pointed out that if you also look at the effect size data, the confidence interval data, all of the data is pointing to somewhat of a benefit of the refeed in this population for this study, but it did not reach the level of statistical significance between the groups.
I think it's really important that you address it because when we're talking about science, we're not talking about dogma. It's not like you have a refeed industry that you want to support or something like that. The big, let's call it big refeed, if you will. So it's really, it's really not like that, but it's all these comments, these letters to the editors, all that stuff. It's really helpful to maybe do better science and to clarify some concepts like you just did with this comment that was published. And one important point that you mentioned was the context of all these studies. We're not talking about obese individuals. We're talking about people that maybe are already lean in terms of the scientific literature, because it's not the same as Instagram lean. But they already they already lean and they want to get leaner, and that's actually your area of research, right?
Yes.
We cannot extrapolate obesity and talk about refeeds for people with obesity to people that are already lean. Could you talk about a little bit of that context? How can we be smart enough to know when to think about refeeds with our clients?
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate what you said. So my research, it helps people optimize their physiques within a maintainable lifestyle. And I don't study obese individuals. Now I used to, as a grad student, I my whole graduate student career spent in obese population, obese females.
Right.
So you make the good point. You got to be careful about what might work for an obese individual or what may work for a lean individual. You got to be careful about extrapolating that to other populations. So I think there's two different ways to look at the refeed. Let's just look at my study. There's two ways to look at it. If you want to look at that data and say it didn't help their metabolisms and it didn't help their muscle mass unless we accounted for the water. And so basically it has no usefulness to a bodybuilder or to somebody. You can make that statement and say, yep, it doesn't help them lose more fat, which clearly it didn't help anybody lose more fat. I don't think that's a good outlook on the interpretation of that data. Now, again, if you're a competitive bodybuilder and you're looking for an advantage, I think that's a very legitimate outlook of the study, potentially. What I think is more important for the type of people like myself who want to look like a bodybuilder but not step on stage, did the refeeds cause any harm? Did it slow down fat loss? And the answer was no. There were no harms done by taking a break on the weekend. So if you're trying to live in a lifestyle, let's say a physique lifestyle, as I like to call it, you now have data that will suggest you can take a break on the weekends and it's not going to harm your progress. I think that's a better interpretation of the study. And again, if you're focusing on the effect sizes, the confidence intervals, and even the p-values, you can also come away with maybe this is actually better. And we suggested two different potential mechanisms as to why a refeed would help with these outcomes in our study.
That's actually what I wanted to discuss next. Let's say we can preserve a little bit more muscle mass. It can help with all that, but how can we explain that it would do so? What would be the mechanism? Is it hormonal? Is it because of the resting metabolic rate being more stable, let's say, not dropping? Or how would it work that we actually preserve more muscle mass?
Yes, and I want to say hello to Rod Penn. He's a former student of mine, and he serves our country, so thank you, Rob, for doing that. The potential, and I'm going to use the word potential mechanisms because we didn't investigate these things. So one of the reasons that refeeds may help is they will increase leptin levels. So other research in postmenopausal women, I think it was postmenopausal women, when they gave a diet refeeds in the form of carbohydrates for several days in a row, it significantly increased leptin levels. And that will help decrease your hunger levels and help you possibly adhere to a diet. So there's one potential benefit of what refeeds may do. In our study, let's look at, well, what were possible reasons why it may have helped retain dry fat-free mass? So why was the group that was taking these refeeds, why were they better able to maintain their muscle mass? There's two reasons that we came up with. One was potentially they could have done greater workouts. So if you have more glycogen levels for 2 days out of the week, and let's say that goes into the third day, maybe your workouts in the day after and 2 days after those refeeds allow you to be more intense in your weights in the loads that you're using, or you can take it closer to failure without getting as fatigued. Now, we monitored every workout, and we told subjects to take it within 2 repetitions of failure on each set. So we did as good of a job we could. But is it possible that they were able to go a little bit further than the other group? There's one potential reason. The other reason is carbohydrates. When you increase carbohydrate intake, you increase insulin secretion. Insulin is a fairly potent suppressor of muscle protein breakdown. So is it possible that 2 days of higher carbohydrate intakes increased insulin and that suppressed the rates of muscle protein breakdown? And then just one other thought, and this is a global thought. The control group was in a catabolic state for 7 straight weeks, let's say 49 or 50 days. It's hard to gain muscle when you're in a caloric deficit for 50 days. But this other group, we brought them out of that deficit every week for 2 days. So they have now this environment or this situation where they're not in a caloric deficit. They are now at caloric maintenance. And if you're at caloric maintenance, you're not increasing muscle protein breakdown as much. Muscle protein synthesis may be able to be higher from the previous workouts. So those are all of the reasons that we hypothesize as to what would account for the changes that we observed.
Very well. I think we can think of being in a caloric deficit as being in the fire, and maybe a refeed gets us out of the fire for a little while. Maybe we can recharge, but mostly, and also, do you think there's some psychological benefits from just being able to say, oh, today I can eat more carbs, maybe I can log some cereal, some Fruit Loops, something that I like that I cannot eat during the week? Do you think it's also an important part, the psychological aspect of a refeed?
Yes. This is my opinion because I'm not a psychologist and we
Right.
didn't collect that data, but I'll speak for myself. I definitely look forward to a like my weekends. Weekends, I typically will increase my calories. Now, right, I'll eat a little bit less during the week and I'll increase my calories on the weekend and we have data. There's research that suggests that that's exactly what people do. They eat more food on the weekends. So I think it's wise to design a diet that works with your natural food intake tendencies. So I can't cite specific science. It may exist. I'm just not on top of that literature. But I personally feel like it is a psychological benefit to be able to look forward to an increase in calories or to have some foods that you wouldn't typically eat when on an extended caloric deficit.
Been there, done that. Last time I
Yeah.
also, yeah, I can relate to that feeling. But also one important thing about that very same point. Do you think there's drawbacks to refeeding? Let's say on the weekend I can eat more, but then when Monday comes, I'm kind of like saddened by Monday coming, and that can also impact adherence in the long term. Do you think there's also that counterpoint that we need to take into account?
I think it's something you need to be aware of. And if you're working with clients, if they're having a hard time adjusting to going back on the diet, that's clearly something to be aware of. But in 2003, there's a study, it was a diet break study, which is very similar to a refeed study. This was by Wing and Jeffrey. They designed an entire study. It's actually very funny. They designed an entire study. And what they wanted to research was people like lapsing on their diets. They wanted people to fail on their diets because they wanted to research why they were failing.
Right.
And what they did in this study, they made them go on a diet break. They basically said this. They said, here are 13 forbidden foods. You may not eat these when you're dieting. And also when you're dieting, we want you to increase your aerobic activity. But then we're going to make you go on a break. And they gave one group a 6-week break. And they said, we now want you to eat these 13 or, these forbidden foods if you normally eat them. And we want you to go back to not exercising since you didn't exercise before the study. What they thought was going to happen was after the 6 weeks, when they told the subjects to go back on the diet, they thought that they were going to really struggle, that they were going to have a hard time adjusting because that's what they wanted to study. And what they found was the subjects had no problem going back on the diet. It essentially ruined their
Right.
initial research question. And they concluded that taking a diet break is a viable option for people for lifestyle reasons, like a vacation, maybe over a holiday. So the research would suggest, and the same thing in my research, it would suggest that people don't have a hard time going back on the diet. I would make one, here's my observation with that. Everything needs to be planned. It can't just be, well, today I feel like going on a diet break. Tomorrow I feel like going. I think there is something important to prescribing this plan or this strategy so that you're not guessing day to day.
Do you think with refits, before talking a little bit of diet breaks, if it's okay by you, do you think it's better to pre-plan it, to be proactive, or maybe be a little bit reactive? Let's say when we begin to encounter a little bit of friction, let's say diet fatigue, let's say or performance in the gym is going down, then we can begin to think maybe I should do a refit, couple day refit, or have it planned in advance. Let's say I'm gonna do linear deficit during the week, something percent, and then do a refit to counterbalance the deficit, the weekly deficit. What would be, do you think, the better strategy? Being proactive or a little bit more reactive?
I think having a planning for a reactive response is how I would answer that. And I'll describe that. I don't think there's a lot of utility to say you're going to go on a diet break after 3 weeks of dieting. And the reason I'm cautious, even though that's how we design our studies, the reason I'm cautious to suggest that is, what if you've been on a diet for 3 weeks and you're still highly motivated to diet in the next week? You're losing fat at a very good rate. I would make the argument, if you're highly motivated to diet, if what you're doing has been working for you, I don't know if we want to interrupt that momentum. So rather, I think an approach that I use with clients when I was training them, if we have 2 consecutive weeks where you're not losing fat, despite the fact we've lowered your calories, that's biofeedback that would suggest to me, let's go ahead and take a break or a refeed, whatever works for that client, so that we are being reactive, but we've planned ahead of time when we would be reactive. And it's based on when your body is no longer responding to the current situation.
Very well, Dr. Campbell. So now on to the nitty-gritty details about refeeding. The first question I wanted to ask, who would be a candidate? Do we base our decisions about refeeding based on, let's say, current body fat, on symptoms of diet fatigue, or how can we best assure that this person, this client, is actually a candidate for refeeding?
So I think we have to start with the idea of anybody who's dieting, anybody who chooses to go on a diet, we have to start right there. So anybody on a diet should consider this. Now, again, if you're a bodybuilder, depending on when your show date is, you might not have this luxury. But for anybody else, if you're going on a diet, I think it's a great conversation, assuming they have a coach, to have a conversation around, okay, what are our thoughts on diet breaks and diet refeeds? So anybody on a diet should consider it. And I think for the population that I like to serve, which is, like I said, fitness enthusiasts who are trying to get leaner, if they find themselves normally wanting to eat more food on the weekends, if that's their normal lifestyle, I think they are a great candidate for this type of approach. Let's be a little bit more strict Monday through Friday, and then let's release, or let the caloric deficit not be as severe on the weekends, and actually going back to maintenance levels. So the 2 types of people are anybody dieting, somebody that's also not responding to caloric deficit, and then the 3rd type of person would be somebody who naturally likes to increase their food on the weekends. I think those would be the types of candidates that should consider this.
Very well. And about the details of a refeed, let's begin with the most obvious one. Why carbohydrates? Why do we need to raise our calories from carbohydrates? I'm sorry. Why not protein? Why not fats? Why does it need to be carbohydrates, or it's better if it's carbohydrates?
So we based our decision on making it a carbohydrate refeed based on some other research that I talked about earlier. In females who increase carbohydrates, it increased leptin levels. And if leptin levels are higher, you're going to be less hungry. And that seems to be associated with better adherence to a diet. So that's why we did it. The other thing I like about carbs, which we talked about earlier, more carbs is more insulin. More insulin will suppress muscle protein breakdown. So we have a mechanism that can be attached back to carbohydrates. Why not protein? Well, in our study, protein was high all throughout. It was I can't remember.
1.8, right?
Yeah,
Right.
In my studies, we always do 1.6 to 2.2, and I can't remember which study we did what, but yeah, I think it was 1.8. Right. So protein never changed. Even on the weekends, we said we still want you to have this high protein. Now, what about fat? I don't know if increasing fat for 2 days would have a beneficial impact. There's just no data to suggest that it's better or worse. I would say practically what I tell people to do is you don't have to worry about the carbs or the fats. Do what you like best, because just getting out of that caloric deficit will likely have a positive impact on your long-term progression.
Very well. And do we need to go to maintenance like you did in your study, that you went to maintenance, or is it possibly a benefit or not a benefit from going to a little bit of a surplus?
That's a really good question. And I want to make this statement. If you look at all, and there's not many, less than 10, all of the diet break studies even the other refeed studies, what we see is a consistent theme. Typically, there's no benefit. They're no worse, but they're no benefit. Every time there's a benefit to a diet break, they have always increased calories back to maintenance levels or what may be a slight surplus. You have to resist the temptation to increase your calories just a little, but you're still in a caloric deficit. There is no research to suggest that that is an effective approach. So you do need to go back to maintenance levels if we're trying to tie it to the research studies that have shown a benefit. And the reality is, if you've been dieting for 4 weeks, you probably lost some weight, you've lost some fat, your metabolic rate's probably a little lower. So if you go back to maintenance levels or pre-diet maintenance levels, it probably naturally is a little bit of a surplus a couple weeks into the diet. So that's what we did. We took them back to maintenance calories, but fully aware they may and likely were in a slight surplus for especially during maybe weeks 5, 6, and 7 of our study.
Very well. If we, let's say for intellectual purposes, if we go to a surplus, let's say a bigger surplus, do you think this would have an additional benefit? Maybe again on the psychological aspect, let's say, because sometimes it's hard for some people. I think it depends mostly on the mentality. It's hard that, okay, I can increase my calories, but a refeed and going back to maintenance, it's actually not that much food. It's really not like some people think that a refeed is like a whole pizza to yourself. Maybe not. Maybe it's just a little cup of oatmeal and there you go. That's your refeed. Do you think
Yeah.
increasing a little intentionally to a surplus would actually convey some additional benefits?
Yeah. So now you're making very good points. Because you're going back to maintenance, you're still having to restrict what you want to do. Because I want to eat the pizza and the buffalo wings and the milkshake and the chocolate chip cookies. I could go on and on.
Yeah,
But
I know.
you are still having to control your intake. Yes, it's back to maintenance. And what I found is it's still nice because you're not dieting. So it is a nice treat to increase the calories. But you do have to guard against this food orgy mentality where I can just eat anything I want. I think if you're going to do that, you are no longer going to achieve your goal of optimal body fat loss. And I would not suggest an uninhibited cheat day where it can be insane calories. I think you would likely do more harm for your fat loss goals than good under this strategy.
Yeah, and then we begin to swim in eating disorders. And some people use refeeds, diet breaks, maybe as an excuse. You see it a lot in social media, like, oh, time to refeed, and you see a pizza to themselves, like 3 boxes of cereal, and that's not a refeed. That's like going 3 times your total energy intake. And some people can actually make that mistake of thinking that a refeed is free for all.
Yeah. And I guess that's the unfortunate part of the social media space. I've heard stories of people doing that and they've lost fat, but you never see how much they starve themselves for the other 6 days to be able to lose fat. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
Very well, Dr. Campbell. Can we talk a little bit about the difference between refeeds and diet breaks and how to actually do either one of them? How can we structure a refeed or a diet break, and what would be the context to make a decision? Let's say refeeds may be more interesting here and diet breaks would be more interesting there.
Yes. So we've been using the word diet refeed a lot, and typically that's defined as 1, 2, maybe even 3 days of increasing caloric intake. A diet break is typically defined in weeks. So a week or maybe even 2 weeks of a complete break from the diet. So conceptually, they're the same thing. You're stopping the diet and you're increasing calories back to maintenance levels, according to the research. The only difference is a refeed is a couple days of increasing calories. A diet break is a week or 2 weeks, maybe even longer, of taking a complete break from the diet. And I don't know if you know this, but my lab, we just did a diet break study where we're just about ready to submit it for publication. You mentioned Dr. Eric Trexler. He was our data analyst for that study. So he analyzed all of our data.
Right.
Do you know Menno Henselmans?
Sure, I just had a recent talk. It was last week with Menno.
Okay, so he helped design the study, him and his partner Frederick,
Cool.
and they actually funded the study as well. So hopefully that will be published in the next few months. And that one was a diet break study where we gave resistance trained females a 1 week break from the diet every 2 weeks.
It's like a more elaborate version and more extrapolable version than the Matador study, right?
Yes,
Entire weeks.
Matador study in obese males. That was a really good study. My study was in resistance trained females for a much shorter period of time.
And one interesting point, if we're talking about females, do you think there's some consideration that we need to take into account because of the menstrual cycle in regards to water retention, glycogen, hormonal changes, and changes in appetite? Do you think this is also important to take that into account, or it's not really that important in this context?
I mean, it depends. When you look at the research would tend to, most of the research that I've read on this area says that there's not much of a difference in water retention in females during the cycle. So there is likely, because I've asked females this and some researchers, I'm like, well, I always thought that you had a much greater water retention. And the answer that I've been told is water retention doesn't change much, but the distribution of the water tends to go towards the midsection more. So there's more bloating in that section. So when looking at body composition, if there's not going to be a change in water, then I'm not as concerned with the measures. Now, the reality is we always measure total body water in our studies. So even if there was a change, we can account for it. So I don't want to say that it's not important, but I'm not at the point where I'm designing diets around that, around the menstrual cycle either. But some people do.
Yeah, and we began to talk about maybe pseudoscience when they say, oh, a diet based on the menstrual cycle, all that. I just wanted to take that into account because if we're talking about females, just to take that into consideration because maybe it can alter some of the results.
Yes. Yeah, it's a question you always have to ask for sure.
And a question about that diet break story, are you allowed yet to discuss some of the results or not yet?
I can talk about a few of the results. We did present some of the findings at the FISSN conference.
Cool.
So what we found in this diet break study was, and let me just give you the context. It was a 6-week diet study. So one group dieted for 6 straight weeks. The other group also dieted for 6 weeks, but every 2 weeks they took a 1 week diet break. So they dieted for 2 weeks, took a 1 week diet break, dieted for 2 more weeks, took a second diet break, and then they dieted for the third 2 week period. So there was a matching of 6 weeks of dieting. What we found at the end of the study was there were no differences in body composition or metabolic rate between the two groups. So the diet break did not offer an advantage. However, I would still interpret this like this. If you're looking to take a diet break and think it's going to cause you to lose more fat, it's not going to do that. But again, if you're going to go on a vacation or you're tired of dieting and you go on a break and you go back to maintenance calories, is it going to cause you harm? No. It doesn't. There was no difference in the amount of fat loss or the amount of muscle. Well, actually, they retained their muscle. There was just no negative impacts. I think that's just as powerful. We did have one significant difference between the groups, and this is pretty important. And this was a psychological factor. We used what's known as the 3-factor eating questionnaire or the eating inventory. One of those measures is disinhibition, or let's call it uncontrolled eating. So this is the feeling of pretty high hunger levels. The trends were significantly different between the groups. The group that never took the diet break, their uncontrolled eating scores were going up. The group with the diet breaks in their study, their uncontrolled eating scores were going down. Now, if we were to extrapolate that, that gives us much greater confidence that the diet break group would likely have greater, longer term weight loss outcomes because they're not having these high, uncontrolled eating feelings. But we didn't measure out past the 6 weeks, but we did come up with that significant finding.
Very well. I'll be sure to look forward to that study. I'll be checking your Instagram daily. Do you have any
Yes.
date for the publication, Dr. Campbell?
So we're just about to send it out to my co-author. So Madeline
Right.
Seidler was my research coordinator at the time. We just finished our draft, so now we have to make sure that all the co-authors are fine with it. So probably in about 2 weeks, we'll get it back from them, and then we're going to submit to a journal. Not positive which journal yet, but
Right.
I would say by March 1st, right around March is when we'll submit it. And then if all goes well, maybe it will be published by April or May.
Cool. We're looking forward. So one last point. I think it's important that we think about all these strategies, refeeds, diet breaks as tools, because I was watching a recent podcast with you and Mike Matthews, where you
Yeah.
spoke about simplicity. That this is all this information about refeeding, about diet breaks. It's not to overcomplicate things. It's to actually make them easier. Let's say you're beginning to encounter friction with your diet. Well, we have these tools in our arsenal. Not about complicating and beginning a diet and thinking, oh, after something days, I'm gonna do a refeed with something percent of my calories, and that sometimes it's like the impression that some people have with refeeds, with diet breaks, that it overcomplicates things.
Yeah, it's one of the areas that I try to guard against. In my research team, we have core values. One of our core values is to keep things simple.
Totally.
And dieting, man, you can make it so even exercise, you can really make it complicated. Doesn't have to be.
Very well, Dr. Campbell. So finally, could you give us some practical takeaways on how to implement the refeed, please?
Yeah. And I just want to thank you again for the invitation. And I really appreciate all your questions. This was a very, very good conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell.
I think just a practical application to refeeds, and again, refeeds would be increasing calories for a day or two. If you find yourself wanting to go on a diet and you make that choice, and you already know that you like to go out to eat on the weekends, or you typically eat more food on the weekends, I think it makes sense to structure a diet that works with your natural food preferences, your natural lifestyle food choices. So that is me. That describes me. I go out to eat with my family, usually Saturday. Typically we'll get pizza on Sunday. I don't work as much, so I'm hungrier because I'm not as distracted. So to me, designing a diet for my lifestyle makes sense, and this 2-day refeed makes sense for people like me.
Very well. So I want to be super respectful of your time, Dr. Campbell. It's been a huge pleasure, a huge honor. I'll be sure to look forward to that study, to the publication. So, any last words about refeeds, diet breaks that maybe we missed on the conversation?
No, I don't think so. I think you did a really good, like I said, you were very well prepared. I think you asked about everything you could ask.
Oh, you're gonna make me blush. Stop it, you. So very well, Dr. Campbell. Thanks again. I'm really, really grateful for your time, for all the learning, and I'll be sure to do a little bit of a.
Okay. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Very well. So have a great day, Dr. Campbell, and thanks again.
All right. You too. Bye.
See you.